Well, good morning. What we're going to do is we're going to tie the Kreelex pattern. This was a pattern developed by the late and great Chuck Kraft. Originally, I believe it was tied for more, warm water species, including bass. But recently, I found this pattern through a couple friends to be incredibly effective as a trout pattern. And within recent development of some of the ways that we fish streamers, definitely using traditional floating lines, sinking lines, and sink tips is always a good approach. But you can also look at streamer fishing just like with nymph fishing. When you're not moving fish effectively or on a regular basis, one of the things you can do is you can definitely change fly color, but one of the things I like to do is just change your depth. Work your flies a little bit slower, a little bit deeper. And when you switch from a traditional fly line, whether that's a sinking line or a sink tip, anytime you're laying line leader in the water, the greater the length of the line in the water, the more surface drag you're creating, no matter what the sink rate of that line is. So this is the old school approach of fishing streamers, where it's almost like fishing live minnows with monofilament. We're going to be incorporating a European Nymphing rig with this fly, but we're going to be casting upstream usually, keeping most of the line leader off the water like you would with a Euro or a tight line system. But the less line on the water, the less drag. This is going to allow this fly to quickly plummet. And this fly, even though the original was tied with dumbbell eyes, very similar to like a Clouser style, we're going to tie this on a jig style hook. And it doesn't have to be on a jig, but I prefer to fish them on jigs. And what I like about this particular pattern is very similar if you're familiar with like the Perdigon hard body nymphs. This is a very similar concept in my opinion, because this fly is very thin in profile. So once it hits the water surface, it's going to quickly drop down like a rock. And more importantly is when you're working this approach with this jig technique and you're working those flies nice and soft, sometimes you're not always swimming your flies through a hard speed, but often you're just slowly lifting and dropping. The takes are not always going to be vicious. And what I like about this pattern, unlike some of the original patterns I used to tie, like the Bunker Buster, which incorporated wool and rabbit with the concept of thinking that material is going to absorb water and it's going to help the fly sink. This fly, when you pull it through the water column, it's going to glide and it's almost going to slice through the water column, compared to the other pattern that has the wool and the rabbit, which it definitely gets down, it definitely catches fish. But when you're pulling that fly through the water column, it feels like you're dragging a wet sock. This fly, or any material or any fly that's tied with materials that are more water phobic, they're going to shed water, you can slice this thing through the water column and you can feel every time you lift and drop that fly. It's going to give you a heightened sensitivity, I believe, when you're jigging your flies. So what we're going to do is just show you how to tie this incredibly simple yet most effective pattern by Mr. Kraft. For this pattern, which is really, really cool, it's one material. It's a Kreelex material. Comes on different hanks. I get mine from Eastern Trophies, or I'm sure there's a number of other synthetic materials that you can use in its place, but this is just fantastic stuff. Comes in a long hank. So you're going to pull out your hank. We're going to have two colors. This color scheme here is going to be a silver and a gold. We take the long section of the hank and we lean that over towards the bend. We're going to tie in the shorter side towards the eye of the fly. And we're going to tie this down. The important thing when you're tying this is making sure that the front tag there's enough of an overhang. Once I secure this down and I have my tail, I'm going to take this front tag and I'm going to fold that back, and it's going to give me a collar or a wing. So make sure there's enough of an overhang to give this to you. We do a pinch technique. This is a 6/0 thread. You can definitely go a little bit heavier if you want, but just make sure that's nice and secure. I like to fold this back. Speeds up the process. Wrap all the way up to the jig head. Now you'll see there's just kind of a little bit of a valley in here. What I'm going to do is when I make my thread, I'm going to make a couple wraps and then I'm going to cinch this right into this groove. So I'm going to lay this down and make one little loose wrap over top. But when I pull, now I'm going to pull towards the eye, cinching that into that valley. Tight. Okay, now we're going to just fold this over. And we're going to wrap back just a little bit on itself. Build a little bit of a thread dam. to kind of help tame and kind of keep that wing folded back. So for the wing, what I like doing is just going slightly beyond the bend. It's all personal preference. And there's our wing. For the tail, it's personal preference, but I like going about 1.5 times the length of the shank approximately, and we're going to cut. As you know, the easiest thing to do is go long, and then it's always easier to take off than it is to add on when you decide you need a longer tail when fishing. Okay, so there's our top section. Simple, you're with me? Now we're going to invert this. We're going to turn this upside down. Now we're going to tie in just our collar or our wing with gold. Take your hank, trim it. Sometimes we're going to just kind of just wet this down to kind of help bind these fibers to make it a little more manageable. We're just going to tie in a clump, a wing right here. Tie this down, right as we did before, with the silver on top. And then we're just going to fold this back on itself. Wrap back a little bit on the material to kind of help tame it to go back in that direction. And this, we're not using the tail, we already have our tail. This is just going to be for the collar. We're going to trim down about the same height and length as the silver. Now what we're going to do is just kind of finish off this fly. If you want to make this fly all nice and pretty, you definitely can, but I keep these flies pretty simple. I end up losing a good bit of these flies, so I don't get too crazy making the flies super pretty. This is just a fish catcher. And I'm going to use a little UV resin here to kind of lock this down. This pattern right here, incredibly simple, and I think with this tail, what I like about this pattern, it's like most good streamer patterns, kind of has a heftier front side, but the tail is really kind of long and limp. And when you're jigging this fly up and down, or even if you're just jigging your fly with this, especially with the European Nymphing rods, the rods that have those nice long light tips, what you can do is you can just take your finger, your index finger, just tap the blank during the drift, and you'll see this tail, it just sends a shock wave up the leader, down to the fly, and you'll see this tail just go wiggle, 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 wiggle back and forth. So this is just a cool pattern, again, designed, for other species, but I have found this to be probably one of my top trout producing streamers in combination with a European Nymphing rig. So I hope you enjoy this. I hope this helps. Keeping your pattern selection simple and finding simple patterns that catch fish, and wishing you all the best. Take care.